everybody. Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me, as always, are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hey there, Rob. I know that was perfect, wasn't it?
Oh, it's Jack
me.
Lila.
Jack Lila. Jack Lila. Here on your radio raves. Radio raves.
And it's me, Diana.
Wow. That was good. You guys want to do a take two on that one? Or
No.
That's audio gold?
That's audio
That's a
gold.
wrap.
Good. Oh,
That's
good.
how I'm going to talk today. I'm going to talk in this voice. Well, even when I talk about my article, I'm going to be like, hey, everyone, let's make decisions.
This is what happens when we record at not our normal recording time.
I'm ready.
You're ready? Mm-hmm. That's good. I woke up very early, yet I still feel very tired. So I hope it does not come through in my sleepy voice, which is, 200 plus episodes. I had the exact same introduction. I feel like this one, a little low energy. I feel like people are going to be upset, but I will do my best.
You're using your sleepy voice. Jackie's using her bedroom voice.
Hi.
And I'm using my caffeinated voice. And I'm ready.
You ready?
Let's do this.
Great. All right. But this isn't a podcast about the various voices we all use in our day-to-day lives. It's a podcast about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research, where every week we pick a topic related to the field and discuss relevant research articles. And this week we're going to be talking about decision-making for kids, which is a broad title. And as we get into the articles we'll be discussing, I think we'll sort of hone a little bit more into exactly what we mean when we say decision-making, because there are a lot of decision points to make. How much bedroom voice to use, how sleepy to sound, how much caffeine to drink prior to recording a podcast. So many decisions. So we will get into a little bit more about exactly which decisions we're talking about. But first, why don't we review the articles for this episode?
We're going to talk about 4 articles for today, and they are quite the potpourri of articles, as you will soon discover. So some of them have data, some of them don't have data, some of them just have good ideas.
One of them's just a bunch of ideas on a napkin. I was really
No,
shocked.
Stop that. No. I think we're going to have a good convo about these. And the 4 articles that we will discuss are as follows. Teaching Choice Making to Elementary Students with Mild to Moderate Disabilities by Coate, Sparks, and Coate. That was published in Intervention in School and Clinic 2012. We also have Increasing Choice Making in Students with Intellectual Disability by Sparks, Pierce, Higgins, Miller, and Tandy, and that was in Education and Training in Autism and Developmental Disabilities 2016. Then we have Promoting Social Inclusion, a Structured Intervention for Enhancing Interpersonal Problem-Solving Skills in Children with Mild Intellectual Disabilities by Vlachou and Savrusi. That was published in Support for Learning 2016. And finally, Effects of Teaching a Problem-Solving Strategy on Preschool Children with Problem Behavior by Hune and Nelson, Behavioral Disorders 2002.
Excellent. Now, like we already talked about, when we say decision-making, sort of implies a lot of possible directions to go.
Sure.
And Dinah, this was an episode that you wanted to put on the docket, and sort of in talking about it, we sort of had the conversation, okay, well, decision-making, how is that different than problem-solving? How is that different than choice-making? Mm-hmm. And while I think we could talk about the differences in terms of the types of literature and the types of research that we're discussing in this episode versus, say, an episode that we did way back when on choice with Dr. Alan Carcina.
That was episode 9, Rob.
That was a long time ago, right? I think when we talk about sort of a conceptual difference, I mean, what do we all see as the difference between those? Is there a difference? Is it a relevant difference? Are we more talking about context versus, say, behavioral mechanisms?
Well, I think that there in the literature is a lot of overlap between these topics, and I wanted to do this topic because I was actually researching choice-making literature, and that is a topic that we reviewed long ago in episode 9 with Dr. Alan Carcina. But we were really in that episode looking at choice a lot more broadly and talking about some of the underlying behavioral mechanisms that might be at play when we are introducing choice and choice scenarios, which is a really good topic, but different than how does one teach someone to make a choice? right? And so that's the topic that I was actually interested in and had been doing some background, searching around to find articles related to. And you may have noticed even in the discussion of the titles of these articles, they cover the gamut of these three topics. Some of them are called making choices, some of them are called problem solving, and some of them are called decision making. So the distinction between them within the literature is not distinct. It's very murky, in fact. And I also don't want to be remiss in noting that we have done an episode on problem solving with Dr. Judah Axe, and I think it's 33. I have to look.
I'll look.
I actually forgot. Usually I'm very good at that.
We recorded it at our
32.
dining room table.
32.
32?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. My bad.
I remember 'cause Dr. Axe came by our house, our recording studio, I should say, and we did it at the dining room recording studio
Yes.
back in the day. So that was a while ago.
So we already covered both of those topics, but for this one, I really was interested in not that question I just presented to you. How do we teach sort of the very beginnings of choice making that are maybe more simplistic for individuals with significant support needs, which I think is a very interesting topic, of which there's very little research, and I'm hopefully in like a year or two going to have more research for you because I'm interested in this question. But this other, bucket of research that there is sort of limited evidence-based support for, but I think is also a really important question, is how do you set up teaching decision-making for children, perhaps with some level of support needs as referenced in the titles of these articles here. And I think that there's obviously overlap with choice, and there's also going to be overlap with problem solving. But problem solving, when we approach that with Dr. Axe, was really from the perspective of establishing a verbal behavior repertoire and rule-governed repertoire around making these types of decisions, including solving problems that have a clear-cut answer, right? So how does one go about arriving at the solution for which there is an agreed-upon answer? And that's different than choice making, which is perhaps you're being presented with two preferred items and you just need to select one of those two items, and there may be consequences related to it, but the immediate consequences then provided to you in the here and now. There's area in between those two, which is what I would consider to be decision making, where the consequence is going to be directly relevant to you as a person, and there's might be some level of immediate consequence, but there may also be a longer term consequence coming to you someday. And with decision making, it's highly personal, highly relevant, and the set of skills that you're looking to establish there is that you're identifying the problem, weighing the potential solutions or options that are available to you, and then maybe doing some level of weight again of what are the immediate consequences for this solution versus the long-term consequences for this solution, and making a selection of what you're going to do next based on those. Right? So that was the question I was interested in asking. I don't think this is a question that only individuals with disabilities need to learn how to do. Everyone has to learn how to make these types of decisions. So I think it's highly relevant, but it's still limited in what's kind of available and out there in the literature. So that's the background on the distinction between those three. Plenty of other researchers might disagree with me on the distinction between those three because, again, it's quite murky. But the two studies that we have by Dr. Coate Sparks, and later she, I think, just uses Sparks or just uses Coate. It's I think, and this is an aside, Coate Sparks and Coate is my article. I think they are a mother-daughter pair.
Ooh.
Yeah. Yeah.
I hope that happens with me.
I know, right? So I think the daughter goes on and maybe uses a different name in the future, but they have done some of the interesting work, I think, in trying to define this and give us somewhat of an operational definition on this idea of, they call it choice making, but what I would call decision making. So it's more than just selecting between two immediately available comparison pieces, right? So they said that if we're looking at how we might teach this skill for students who have a moderate or mild disability, likely this is a skill that would need to be taught. It could be taught using direct instruction, so presenting a lot of opportunities to practice the skill, laying out clear contingencies to have students learn this sort of more in the abstract and then apply it to relevant situations. with the goal of them having these strategies to be able to use and then make and evaluate the choices that they've made. So we know there's a lot of literature out there suggesting the students benefit from having the opportunity to choose. And I love the topic of choice. I think that it's incredibly important in identifying ways in which we can build in autonomy and client dignity into our day-to-day practices. So we already know that it's important to include choice, but we also have to teach individuals how to make choices. And sometimes we maybe assume that that is already in place, and it isn't necessarily in place. So they broadly define choice as an expression of your wishes or desires. But
I wish for $1 million.
And a nap.
Right?
That's my choice.
But sometimes those choices aren't always available. So then they have to go further than that and say, in this article, they're defining it in really a more complex way by including some of those additional sort of, weighing pieces of the availability of the choice, what the long-term consequences could be, et cetera. So when they're talking about choice making, I'm defining it as decision making. So they said, first of all, we should think about how if you were, and this article is from the perspective of being a teacher in the classroom, right? How could you build in choice opportunities into your daily routines and interactions with your students? They said teachers should first check to see how their students express choice. So can they point? Can they request? Can they identify their choices verbally? What is their students' ability to make age-appropriate choices? And what is their ability to follow sequential steps in making those choices? Because remember, the way they're defining this, this decision-making process involves several steps. And so then the goal, if you identify these steps and say, okay, this is what my students need to be able to do in order to go through this process, then you got to actually figure out how you're going to teach that particular skill. So the goal of going through this instructional process would be that you're teaching your students to express their preferences and interests, but doesn't stop there. Then they need to understand the risks involved in making a choice. And then they need to be able to evaluate the choice that they made, whether it was a good choice or not a good choice, based on the consequences that occurred. They say, okay, this is what we want to do. How are we going to do it? And they lay out for us 6 steps. And this is one of those hypothetical articles. They're like, we think this would be a great idea, but we don't have data. We didn't get to the data part. This was just one of those great idea types of papers.
Which we need.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah,
we need
that's
the great
where you
idea.
have to start. Exactly. So it starts us off by saying, okay, we think that in order to teach this type of decision-making, there will probably be 6 steps that would be involved for the teacher to set up this type of opportunity. Because remember, we're looking at this from an instructional perspective. Okay, so step number 1 is to create a scenario and review the scenario with the students. So I'm going to give you the example that one of the examples that they included here in the article. So here's the scenario. Derek's lunch costs $2 a day. His mother gave him $10 for his lunches for the school week. When entering the cafeteria, he sees the Snack Shack is selling cheddar fries for $3. They are Derek's favorite snack.
Same.
I know, right? How should Derek choose to spend his money? All right, so that's the scenario, right? So this is way beyond just, do you want to play with the Legos or the silly putty type of thing. This is a lot more complex. So they said that would be step number 1. The teacher would present a scenario, and then they would provide 3 potential choices. But when they're talking about choices, the choice also includes some likely consequences. So it's trying to give the student some context. So choice A, all I bought was chips and now I have no money left for the week. I'm going to be in trouble. Choice B, I got my favorite chips, but now I do not have any money for lunch today. My mom is not going to be happy. Choice C, I think I will wait until I get home and ask my mom for some money to buy chips from the Snack Shack. All right, so they present that. The student is then supposed to pick choice A, B, or C. The adult then is called recycle the first choice, which basically means review it with them and help them evaluate whether it was what they call an awful choice, a good choice, or the best choice. And they said that maybe they would have like index cards available. So there's like a textual component to this. There's also even a worksheet they provide as a way that you could help the students walk through and evaluate their choice. And if it turns out what they chose was maybe not the best choice, then they can go back to the choice list and recycle a second choice, meaning they pick a number 2 option.
What do they do with that first choice? Like compost it or throw it down the garbage disposal?
Right. Well, in fact, Rob, reduce, reuse, recycle should be done in that particular order. So
Gotcha.
we can't really reuse it. So the best option would be to just reduce it, which is what I would call eliminate it. Okay. They recycle that second choice and then they reevaluate with the second choice. And this is all set up in order to sort of establish this series of events for future use, right? So you're practicing this skill with kids so that they can later on, hopefully, identify 3 potential choices on their own, make some predictions about what the likely consequences of those would be, and then through this series of choices, through this series of decisions, pick the best choice, right? So they're just setting
You got to choose the choice.
Choose the choice with the decision-making model that they anticipate would be beneficial to students, but they didn't actually test it with any data.
Not yet.
Not yet. No, not yet. Did you guys like my little guy that I put in my notes?
Yeah.
He's like the shrug emoji, but I made him out of just the keyboard. Do you see him in there?
I saw him.
Oh, there he is.
Tilde, backslash, underscore, big letter O, underscore, /tilde. So he's like, I put that in there.
I didn't know what that was.
And then just one more thing I want to note for everyone in case they're thinking about...
Looks like it's like a semaphore flag man.
Yeah. Well, he's supposed to be like shrugging his shoulders. It was not easy to do.
No.
I wanted you to appreciate it.
ASCII art it's a lost art.
What's it called?
ASCII art.
Oh, like the keyboard?
Make all the symbols and then they turn into like big fancy words or a picture. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Like when you write 5005. Oh no, what's that? When you write
What?
boob on the calculator.
8008. That's a little different. I don't know what that's called.
That's just calculator art.
That's calculator.
It's sort of like from the old days when you'd be at MIT and you'd have your big mainframe computer and you were like, what are we going to do with all these fancy computers with all their 2K of memory? Well, they make video games, and then everything was made out of just, pluses and minuses, and let your imagination run wild. Kids today, they don't have as much ASCII art.
I didn't know that's what it was called, so thank you for that.
You're welcome.
All right, and the only other thing I want to note, in case folks out there are interested in attempting to set up some decision-making curricula on your own in your classroom, is Table 1 in this article gives a whole list of, at the time, currently available choice-making curricula. I did not go in and research each of these,
I think
but
that's fair.
they list 7 different ones and the prices for those, ranging all the way from something like ChoiceWorks, which people might know of as being a schedule that you can set up, to the Choose Your Own Adventure series of novels, right, as a way to help kids sort of frame this decision-making process, all the way up through something called Social Story Readers, and a curriculum just called Making Choices, but which is a cognitive problem-solving text with lesson plans. So those are in there if people are interested, and they have websites and pricing. Yeah. And that's it. So that sets us up maybe with some sort of overall decision-making framework from which we can then see if there's anyone who's tested this out.
All right. Well, I think having that framework is a great start. But like we said at the beginning, or like you said at the beginning of the episode, Dinah, there isn't a lot of research in this particular area. So some of what we'll be discussing for the rest of the episode will have to do with variations on kind of that initial framework and how it has been reflected in what literature exists. I know one area that we've seen this is in previous guest, Dr. Adele Nadowski's Flexible and Focused book. That is a whole section on problem solving, which follows a lot of the steps of that framework. And I wish I could say that I was able to review it for this episode. Sadly, my office is having asbestos removed from it, so most of my books are in a box, and they got moved to a different building, so I'm not exactly sure where my copy is. I've used her problem-solving framework in the past year, but I haven't used the whole procedure in a while, so I didn't want to just start shooting off the cuff without having it in front of me. But
all right, that's episode 107.
That general framework is in there for working with children with autism or ADD. But we'll be talking about some other research articles, one of which, Hune and Nelson, from 2002, predates some of Sparks's works. And we'll read like that in terms of its layout and the quality of data and quality of the procedure that was used. The goal here was to take that idea of what we're calling kind of decision making, which they refer to as sort of social problem solving. Their definition, quote, the ability to resolve successfully and appropriately conflicts or problems that arise in real life interpersonal situations, which is probably one of the key areas where decision making is going to come into play, because there's not exactly a right answer, which you might see in some of the problem solving research. There is going to be a response that will either work in the moment or not work in the moment. And just because it doesn't work in the moment doesn't mean it's not the best response, because in the long term, it may actually result in, more appropriate friendship skills, or may result in better conflict resolution down the road rather than exactly in that moment. And Hune and Nelson wanted to see, well, what if we could work on this social problem solving or decision making for young children? Because again, while a lot of individuals will just sort of develop this skill over time in multiple practice opportunities, children who have maybe cognitive or physical or linguistic or intellectual impairments or delays are going to find it harder to engage in these levels of decision making, meaning they might make decisions that result in unplanned consequences that maybe are effective in the moment, but are not effective in terms of their long-term ability to develop friendships or to develop meaningful relationships. So Hune and Nelson said, well, what if we set up a teaching method for this type of problem solving with our preschoolers? Because the sooner you intervene in the ability of children to make meaningful decisions in these social contexts, the more practice they're going to get, the more beneficial outcomes they will contact much, much sooner. And also, the simpler the problems that they will be asked to face. Child took my thing is, kind of the common problem for a 3-year-old. Whereas when you were an adult, someone taking your stuff and how do you react isn't a very common problem anymore. Problems become much more complex and multidimensional. So the goal here was, let's help children develop positive alternate solutions that they can generate. And the more solutions they have, they'll be able to pick the best one. So again, this isn't taking into account some of the choice-making literature in that there's an assumption that if children have good solutions, they'll always pick the best one, which some of our other studies will look at and say isn't necessarily a foregone conclusion. So in this study, we have a number of students, 9 teacher-nominated preschoolers. Wouldn't it be nice to be nominated by your teacher as unable to solve problems, or because they are so aggressive? You win the award for most aggressive student in my classroom. These were preschoolers who are 3-year 11-month to 4-year 11 months old. They were in a Head Start program, and they engaged in frequent aggressive behavior. They all had intact language and cognitive skills. They were able to attend to lessons. So they should have been able to problem solve. There's no reason that they couldn't engage in meaningful decision making to resolve their conflicts. They can,
but maybe no one taught them.
Yes. Well, there was no nothing you could point at and say, aha, this might explain this challenge. I mean, there are reasons we could look at too, but none that appeared in the classroom. So we had children broken into treatment and non-treatment groups in what will be a fabulous A-B design, which really weakens any results that we're going to get here. And the goal was to look at, well, how do students solve social problems? So using aggressive versus non-aggressive solutions. So do they come up with the right solutions in small training sessions? Also, how much aggression do they then engage in during a 10-minute follow-up observation during typical preschool activities like a free play or centers? So the instruction component really just featured kind of this one-to-one daily session with each student individually. They'd give them directions about what they were going to talk about. We're talking about problem solving. They'd review a behavior management procedure. Some of the students didn't need this, but a number of them needed to earn smiley face tokens for sitting in their chair, and then they could trade those in for a backup reinforcer later. I think 3 out of the 4 students in treatment had a system like this. And then they would talk about, why are we learning some new strategy? They would then introduce a social interaction problem. Now, I do love this part. This is probably my favorite part, is how do we break down preschool problems, or how do we break down preschool areas where social decision-making is necessary? Well, there are 3 categories. And again, the reason you want to engage in this instruction as early as possible, because I can name a heck of a lot more problem-solving categories now than I could when I was 3. When you were 3, the problems they came up with were ongoing play problems, acquiring an object problems, and stopping the unwanted action of others. That's
my whole life.
Yeah, that's pretty accurate, I think.
I mean, they're still relatively intact as an adult, but they become more complicated than just sort of those 3 broad categories.
Yeah. Although, honestly, I've been in classrooms with maybe 4-year-old kids, and there's already like exclusion, cliques forming, right?
Yeah.
There are like more complex social problems emerging, probably around age 4.
4.
Yeah.
4.5.
Yeah, it's kind of surprising how young that starts.
So this all, again, happened with these storybooks. The students would be presented with sort of these like little stories. There'd be some sort of a protagonist. The instructor would say, oh, here's the person in charge. Here's the main character of the story. And they tell a story up to the point of a conflict. So there were 20 different picture books they used. And these, as far as I could tell, were just actual picture books that you'd find in a classroom. They'd review what the problem was. The instructor would review what the protagonist's problem was. They'd talk about different strategies that person could use. They'd have examples and non-examples of pro-social responses. Because the important piece here was not that the children couldn't come up with solutions. It was that their solutions always had to do with, I could hit someone, I could destroy them. One child, when they had problems, might say, I could get a gun.
What?
The person who's causing the problem. Yeah, so again, is that, it's not that they couldn't make a choice or they couldn't come up with a solution to a problem. You could get a gun. That is a solution to a problem.
But not as a preschooler. They're probably just copying, right?
Yes.
They're probably just copying what they see on TV. Right.
Well, I guess it depends on what shows they were watching at the time.
You have limited problem-solving skills as a
Yes.
3-year-old.
Yes.
It's not a great solution at any age to
No.
get a gun to solve your problems,
No.
folks. I'm just going to, pro tip, if get a gun is your solution, find someone to help you generate new solutions. That one's not going to fly. And they would have these picture prompts that they would present to the child to go through the process of deciding what is the problem. So they sort of like model what to do, and then they'd go back and they would have the child take the perspective of another character in the story. This, again, I thought was overly complicated. Why not just do this with the protagonist?
Yeah.
To go through the process of, okay, what's this person's problem? What are some ways they could solve the problem? What could they pick and then do? And how would the other character feel? So they'd model the steps. They'd ask the child to solve the problem from that perspective. And again, I don't know why they didn't use the protagonist, because I had a very hard time following what they were asking the children to do just from reading this article and then reading their appendix where they lay out the exact script that they used. So again, this might be overly complicating the sort of overall model. And then they would praise them for coming up with good solutions and provide gentle prompts like, can you think of a nicer way if the solution were things like, well, they could get a gun, they could, attack them, they could throw something at them, with a goal to link whatever solution the child came up with to some sort of a consequence that came later. They would score the solutions the children came up with as pro-social or aggressive. And then this, I wasn't quite sure. They'd talk about the type of kind of social problem solving that they did as either a hit or a redirect. And I think they meant hit by correct as opposed to hit as in the aggressive solution had a hit involved in it. Again, I had a lot of problems following this article, and I think it was due to some editing challenges.
Now that I have reflected on it, I think that makes sense. Hit means a plus.
Yeah.
And redirect is a minus.
Which, if you're doing an article in which you're talking about kids coming up with hitting as a solution to problem solving, I would recommend choosing a different word.
Yes, it was confusing.
So they do a probe before every instructional setting, and that was sort of where their main data would come for in terms of just some, did they come up with pro-social responses? And really that was the goal. The kids could come up with solutions. Were they pro-social or appropriate solutions? And then after their instruction, where they'd have this convoluted story modeling discussion, they would watch the child for 10 minutes to see how much problem solving did they appropriately engage in. If you're in the non-treatment group, you just got a story that was matched in, quote, the amount of attention to that required by students in the treatment groups. But then they said these were the same stories in the treatment group. So why not just say that? Why get into the fact that they were matched for how much attention was required for the story, which is very hard to measure? I don't know. But they would just tell the story to the non-treatment group and then say, yeah, this is what the child did, and they describe problem solving without any attempt to include the child because they were the non-treatment group. They also had the teachers complete a social skills rating system preschool form to sort of estimate the types of social behaviors that they saw, and that was another pre-post test measure that was used. And again, like I said, it's an A-B design with non-treatment group comparison. Again, maybe multiple baseline across participants would have been a better, stronger experimental model here. So what happened when they did this sort of well scripted, though really just sort of instructional modeling, light prompt, reinforcement for appropriate answers and sitting nicely program? Well, in baseline, we saw 3 of the 4 students were showing actually a decreasing trend in their ability to come up with pro-social solutions. They started making nonsense answers, so the kids were getting bored. This may have been where the behavior plan came into place. After intervention began, there was very little change in the children's ability to come up with pro-social responses. They then changed one of the questions they asked, which was a little bit longer, to the more simple, remember how we... so the original question was, remember how we solved problems, and then asked them to come up with solutions. And then they changed to, remember the steps we used to solve problems. They also added the behavior plan where they had smiley faces for appropriate behavior, attending and sitting. So again, which one was the actual experimental control? You, the viewers at home, get to decide.
I will just note, just one quick thing, is that they, at least for 2 of the participants, the length of baseline was staggered by 1 session.
Okay.
So one of them had 3 baselines and 2 of them had 4. So you could stack it up to make a multiple baseline design, at least across the 2 participants, although it's just 1 session difference. So it's not like super great control. But the directionality of the data within those 2 stack 'em ups is actually pretty good.
Okay.
So
All right.
I wish they had done that.
That would have been a stronger design.
Yeah.
That is true. After they made those 2 changes, they did see that the students started making more pro-social responses. Was it a practice effect? Was it reinforcement? Was it the change in wording to make, a clear discriminative stimulus? I don't know. And the authors aren't quite sure either. Now, so that's all good. So the children were able to come up with better answers for decisions that they could make when faced with social problems in these settings. The pace it took was different for every child. Some of them did very well. Some of them took a lot longer. And then maintenance, you did see maintenance 2 or 3 weeks later in this task for 3 of the 4 students. So they were able to maintain the ability to generate these solutions for, up to about almost a month. Now, did this generalize to the play sessions? So how many aggressive acts were occurring during those 10-minute observations? 2 of the 4 participants in the treatment group showed a decreasing trend in aggression after the treatment was put in place. 3 out of 4 after they changed the cue in the training session to remember the steps we used for problem solving. So again, when the children started showing better results in terms of ability to come up with appropriate decision-making answers, you did see a decrease in aggression for 3 of the 4 participants. Only 2 of them were able to maintain those changes into the maintenance period. One of them actually hadn't even shown much of a difference to their baseline until the maintenance phase, so perhaps needed more time to practice, or was maybe getting some more natural reinforcement from peers for engaging in more appropriate decision-making.
I like that.
Don't know for sure, though. But didn't really show show as good results as other participants during the actual intervention, showed better results in maintenance. And 2 out of the 4 kids actually started using a self-talk strategy. It was anecdotal evidence, but would say things like, think of something else to do. So they would sort of engage in, not exactly private verbal behavior because it was noted, but they would engage in something that was sort of along the lines of problem solving, much like you'd see in academic problem solving.
Yeah.
Say the answer to yourself. Hold the thought in your memory as a cue. You'd start seeing that. I can do something else were some of the statements that they said. One participant actually asked for reinforcement. Hey, look at me, I did problem solving. And when they got a neutral response, never engaged in that problem solving strategy again, which I don't quite know from the text of the article whether or not the author saw that as I think they saw it as sad that he wasn't using it, but I can't tell if they saw the lack of positive praise for look at you using problem solving. I would have said, great, why not praise this kid? Why give a neutral response? But it may have been one of the teachers too. I couldn't quite tell from the article. But again, problem solving, at least for that one child, was probably somehow maintained by social reinforcement from adults.
But it wasn't.
Well, no, it wasn't maintained because they
sensitive?
didn't. It was sensitive to.
Yeah.
Yes, that's it.
I bet he figured it out later, just not in the context of this study.
Yeah. And then the non-treatment group, they were all over the place. You didn't see any trends. So, having no intervention led to no change. This wasn't a developmental
they also
process.
then implemented it with those participants.
Yes.
And had a really nice multiple baseline design.
They also could have remembered to draw that invisible box around their the -1 when they floated their 0 on the graph, which, rookie
Okay, well,
rookie mistake.
This was in 2002, so...
Technology hadn't moved far enough ahead to draw an invisible box around -1? I don't think so. So we did see in the results changes in student behavior, both in their ability to make more appropriate decisions and, at least for some of the participants, in the amount of aggression occurring, showing that they were engaging in more appropriate interaction, whether it was through problem solving or just general interactions. However, when we look at the SSRS score, so the social scores by the teachers, only 2 out of the 4 reported a change in social skills for the participants. One said a slight increase, so I guess you could maybe say 3 out of 4 were saying that there was an increase in the social skills of the students, but only 1 of 4 noted a reduction in problem behavior. And that was for our treatment group. So there may have been a change, but it apparently wasn't socially significant or measurable through the SSRS questionnaire to reflect that change. So what was the procedure that worked here? That's the other piece we don't know. It wasn't the most effective procedure. And was it the fact that they did modeling, that they did practicing? Was it more reinforcement? Was it adult attention? It's really hard to say. Also, some limitations that'll get spoken to in other research is why not use actual student stories to target relevant context rather than sort of arbitrary picture books? Why add the perspective changing component to this procedure? It's already kind of complicated enough. Why take it from a perspective of a character who may or may not even be in the story or be a minor character compared to the protagonist that they're using for the model? Again, the skill seemed hard, and from the procedure written in the article and the script, it may have varied from story to story more significantly than was laid out in this article. So perhaps it was a bad choice that they were presenting as sort of a reflection of the article. Sorry, for the article, I'm not sure. So it does appear that some amount of problem-solving practice, at least with neurotypical students at preschool, can assist in the development of alternate strategies, which may result in better decision-making in these kind of social contexts. But it's a little unclear as to exactly which components were effective, which weren't effective, how much is self-talk an important mediating strategy or not. So not much here. Like you were talking about, Diana, there's not a lot of research in this area. And what there is, I think we're going to kind of see similar patterns to what we saw here of, something's there, but exactly what is unclear.
Right. Well, there's a lot of people that want to talk about choice making, problem solving, decision making, but a lot of these articles are that sort of, grand scale, let's think about the question type of articles, which are great. But as behavior analysts, we want the hard and fast data with operationally defined behaviors.
Yeah.
This seems like a study I would have made where I made it like super overly complicated and then only realized afterwards that I should have asked a much simpler question. Mm-hmm. So, but this was, 20 years ago. So people have gone on to ask simpler questions since then.
Well, we've talked a little bit about the framework. We've talked a little bit about what this could look like with typically developing children at a young age. Let's take a break. And when we get back, we'll talk about decision making for individuals with developmental disabilities. We'll be right back.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD-level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu.
See you there!
And we are back talking about decision making for kids and young adults as well. Before we move into our final half of the show, I want to remind listeners that ABA Inside Track is ACE approved. By listening to the show, you're able to earn 1 learning credit. All you need to do is finish listening and go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, click the Get CEUs button, or you can click the direct link in our show notes page in your podcast player to enter in some important information to get that CE processed. That important information includes a number of pieces, such as a secret code that you will need to get in this episode. We've hidden them out throughout. And here's the first one. It's backhoe, BACKHOE. What is being used to dig a giant hole in my backyard right now? It's a backhoe. It's big and scary, and my children said Dad wouldn't be able to use that. He'd crush the house or something nasty. Thanks, kids.
My dad has one.
Your dad, Jackie's dad, has a backhoe.
Just for fun.
For fun, to dig holes in other people's yards.
Just drives around. Who needs a hole? Who needs a hole? Just kidding.
All right, backhoe. All right, so Jackie, you're up next in terms of the deep dive, and we're going to talk in this back half about not just decision-making, but decision-making when you have the added challenge of some sort of either like an intellectual disability or developmental disability.
I thought this article was spot on. I'm into my article. I'm into it.
Yeah.
Big time.
Yeah.
So my article was a continuation of Diana's article where they were like, now we're actually going to take data on what we thought we might want to do, right? And their reasoning for doing this is that as adults, you have to make choices all the time, major choices, minor choices. Preventing choice-making opportunities may limit quality of life, may limit advocacy. And why aren't we teaching more high school students to make these actual life choices?
Yes.
And what you do when you're presented with this choice. So that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to teach choice making to high school students, but in real life scenarios. So they had a choice making training, and then they also had like a choice making scenario. So the training focused around teaching choices related to job, hygiene, and lifestyle. And they used that in the training with pictures to kind of help move things along. And then secondarily, they looked at to see whether participants identified choice-making opportunities and then made a choice in those opportunities. And what were the choices that they had? So that was their DV and secondary DV. So they had 6 participants in the study. All were 11th and 12th graders. They had 5 females and 1 male. They were identified by the school as receiving special ed services and diagnosed as having an intellectual disability. The researcher-trained assistant, and a special education teacher completed the study, but really it was just a special education teacher, let's be honest. The other people just took data and trained. And it was conducted in a self-contained classroom. So the classroom had a teacher and an aide, and the students were in the classroom about 70% of the day. So during the training, they actually moved to another self-contained classroom to limit distraction, right? Because there's a lot going on.
The school is flush with self-contained
No,
classrooms.
I was like, wow, you got space. And one thing I love is that the sessions occurred every single day at the same time, during the same period, with the same teacher for 12 weeks.
Look, class.
That's some consistency.
It was a class, right? And kudos to that teacher for being there every single day.
That's right.
I think we should have more topics like this that could get covered. There are curricula out there. Maybe the data is not as strong. But that idea of let's do some of these skills regularly because it is going to be important forever.
Yeah. We're doing it every single day. So they used a 200 still picture library for choice making opportunities. So they had pictures with females using deodorant, males using deodorant, right? Jobs, outfits, all sorts of things that they would need. So the IV, the independent variable, it was the choice-making training. And in here, they had 5 pictures that related to training and 5 that were unrelated to training. So they were prompting the students to choose between those. And then the dependent variable was the response following the SD. Can you tell me what choices you have? And so they took data on actually making the choice and verbally replying following the SD. Like, here are all the choices I have. This is the one I'm going to choose. If they failed to respond, they counted as incorrect, and they provide the verbal cue again. And they had this little checklist, which is really cute. It's like choice 1, choice 2, choice 3. You could get 0 points if you got nothing correct, 5 points if you got everything correct. Cool?
Yes.
They used a multiple probe design across participants with replication. I love it because they had 6 participants. First triad, 1, 3, and 5 were in their own little multiple baseline. 2, 4, 6 in their own little baseline. Love that. So they only trained the teacher for an hour and didn't really say how they did it. So they had 2 30-minute sessions, and the training included how to use real-life scenarios, how to conduct choice brainstorming, and to evoke a student. They said elicit a student response, but it's really evoke a student response.
Yeah.
Or occasion, depending.
Yeah.
But yeah.
It would have been a little nice to have more background on that
How?
teacher's education and background.
Right.
I mean, she's teaching
Licensed.
this special education classroom, but we don't know
Anything else about
what
her.
else. Yeah.
The one thing that we do know about her is a jump ahead is in the social validity. They asked social validity before and after the study. She gave the idea about having the whiteboard to write the letters down. They don't say that in the procedures, but they reference it in the results in the social validity. So it would have been nice to be in the procedures. You have to pierce that together.
Yeah.
And she was like, I don't think this is going to work.
Yeah.
She's like, I don't think the students that I'm working with will understand what you're talking about.
Yeah.
But at the end, she was very pleased. Very pleased with what happened. But they were doing
That's
it
good.
every single day, right? For 12 weeks. We don't really know anything else about how she was trained. They do say that one of the limitations of the study is that maybe they could have provided more training to the teacher to give her a little bit more, right? Because 1 hour is like nothing,
Yeah, it's not a lot.
right? They were there
But
to
for some people, it might be plenty. We just don't
Right.
have enough info
We just
to
don't
know.
How much script?
Yeah.
They could have been a lot of scripts or frameworks that sort of.
Right.
She had a lot of curriculum about teaching some of the skills related
Yeah.
to these topics.
Like,
So
I
yeah,
don't
once you
think
get the
I would
framework,
need more
just-
than an hour.
right. Oh, look
But
at
then
you.
again, I don't know.
I would.
Well, to do something once, an hour training is enough to give it a try. I mean, would you do a good job? You probably need more feedback afterwards, but
Yeah, who
I could get
knows?
started with an hour.
Yeah, so who knows? So after the training, they did a screening assessment where they just looked for the participants to identify items and the functions across 5 still photographs. So one of the examples was, what is it? It's a phone. I use it to call my friends. If they could do that, they moved on.
Yeah.
So in baseline, they provided choice-making scenarios. So 2 participants from each triad were chosen to start. After 3 days of probes, everyone else remained in baseline. Right? And so the choice-making scenarios were rather complex. So here's one. Gemma's brother Austin had a job interview at Starbucks. She helped him find an outfit to wear. Gemma helped him pick a new dress shirt and dress pants for his interview. What choice did she make? What choices does she have? So those are the questions that they had to ask. So it's pretty hard.
Yeah.
So no one did great in baseline. Just putting it out there. So then during the training's kind of funny. I think here's where they're very, very specific, but also very vague.
Okay.
Right? Very specific. They said things multiple places in multiple ways, but then they don't really go into what happened.
Yeah.
Right? So
There's kind of a theme in most of these articles
Yeah.
of you kind of get a sense of what the procedure is, but then they
Missing some.
bring up other components in other, like you were saying, in other sections, Jackie, where
Yeah.
you'd be like, oh, okay.
can I pull this out and put it down
I wish
here?
you'd put it here.
Yeah, but that's okay. So the scenarios that they made were designed to increase choice making and expose to real life scenarios, right? So here's an example. You're going to make a choice on how to tell your friend that you're going to attend their birthday party, right? Or you're going to make a choice on how you're going to spend your money, look at that. And you're going to make a choice as to what you're going to wear to a job interview. So those are all things that might happen in your life, right? The training topics included health, recreation, hygiene, and food. So what they did in the training is they had a brief introduction of the scenario, which they called the advanced organizer. They said, okay, this is the part where they probably didn't need to call it the advanced organizer. So they say, okay, remember last time we talked about this scenario. Here's what you did. Today we're going to talk about this, and you're going to learn to make choices. Then they described and modeled, which I called brainstormed ideas.
Yeah.
Right? So here you take the whiteboard, and they're actually like prompting students to think about 5 choices that they have. Then they're going to make a choice based on the photographs. So this is the guided practice. That's what they call it. And they prompted 5 responses here. And so with that Gemma one, it says, your brother has a job interview at Starbucks. You are helping him pick out, not Gemma. You know that he really wants. Can you tell me if this choice would work? Yes or no? Why would this choice work or not work? Right? And then they move on to independent practice with verbal cues, where they give feedback and 5 opportunities. And then this one's like, your brother has a job interview at Starbucks. You're helping him pick out an outfit. You know he really wants to work there. What choices do you have? So then you have to pick those 5 choices.
Yeah.
So you go through all of that.
So it's like a most to least kind of thing there.
And then You could get 5 points for getting all 5 choices. And then they assessed maintenance with those choices and then the other scenarios about the money and that sort of thing. They looked at maintenance. IOA and PI were great, which is good. The researcher and researcher assistant were taking data, so the teacher didn't have to, which is nice. They did say that there was video in a portion of it, but didn't mention it anywhere else, so I'm not sure if they were videotaped or not. It was the teacher understood. They said the teacher understood the video camera capabilities. And I was like, but why do you need a video camera? But there you go. Who knows if they... So they taught some choice with some maintenance, which was great. I love that they have this the graphs look fine, right? But they have this little table that they looked at baseline means, which was between 0 and 40%. They have treatment means, they have a baseline range, and then they have the treatment range, which I really liked. So overall, everyone increased from baseline, which is great. And the treatment range was fairly high with the one exception of one participant that got 0% during treatment, but then bumped back up to 100%. So overall, everyone did really well and maintained...
It was an increasing trend there.
Yes. Yeah. And maintained most of their skills, I think, with one participant not. Participant 4 not maintaining. Oh, and participant 1, 2, and 3. But not they weren't as bad.
It was a little rocky there for the maintenance.
But so then what they also did is they took a non-overlapping data. They calculated non-overlapping data, and that was about 69%. So they said that generally it was minimally effective to moderately effective for all participants. And they said that the whiteboard really helped with prompting. So kudos to the teacher.
Yeah, that's her great suggestion.
For giving that great suggestion. So some of the limitations of the study were that it was conducted quickly, right, over a 12-week period. We don't know what would happen if it was over a longer period of time. They did have a holiday in between there, so when the maintenance data, so they said that it might have been beneficial to have a booster session following the holiday.
Totally.
Made sense to do maintenance, but yeah. But overall, I think it was a really well-designed study. I think it might be hard to replicate, but I don't think...
We're missing some technological details.
Right.
Yeah.
But overall, I think it does lend itself to the literature on decision-making because it's using real-life scenarios that people may actually encounter as adults.
Yeah, I really like that. It seems that it would be really functional for folks to practice this. I also like that they could generate the potential solutions themselves, right? They had to come up with 5 different things. So it wasn't like, oh, you have to pick the 5 things I'm thinking of. Yep. It could be anything as long as it kind of fits in, and then that would have been okay. Because that's what real life is like as well. You don't have to read someone's mind in order to make present choices, right? And this one feels like a really natural extension of the COAT Sparks in COAT 2012 that I just reviewed because they were making an application of their sort of hypotheses that they set out there. Although that one they wrote for elementary and this one was for high school students, but a lot of the same pieces still applied.
Mm-hmm. So on the same subject of teaching, problem solving, and generating solutions, we're going to talk last about Vlaciu and Stavrousi's article, which is more a discussion or a list of an intervention that was used in their special education classroom in Greece, not exactly a study in that there are no results other than anecdotal results presented. However, I do think it kind of captures a nice kind of summary of the areas where decision-making is going to come into play. Being able to generate solutions given certain problems, and then also looking at the generativeness of that skill. In the COAT Sparks article that we just discussed, the idea of coming up with solutions in very specific, though relevant contexts may or may not lead to decision-making occurring in new problems that had not been trained or not been presented or that didn't necessarily occur on a regular basis. So I think looking at Vlaciu and Stavrousi kind of wraps up a lot of what I think we'd like to see in decision-making treatments, though, again, will we see meaningful results? That is not quite clear yet. So this was a study where, this was kind of a write-up of an intervention that has sort of been developed over time in this classroom for students with mild intellectual disabilities, really trying to teach problem solving, I think like we've been presenting it in the articles that we're discussing today, as steps. Problem solving is a series of steps. Something occurs, you choose a solution to the problem, you engage in the solution, or you recycle the solution, and then you evaluate whether it was or was not effective in allowing you to reach your goal. So what I did like about this article was it was very detailed as to exactly what was happening in these treatment or in these teaching opportunities. It began with a phase or 4 phases, and it began with the first phase of just an assessment of the problem-solving skills of the students who were in the classroom. So how much problem solving did they engage in regularly? Could they identify problems? Could they identify solutions? There were some other questionnaires, one that was kind of a published questionnaire, one that was created by, I believe, by the authors, sort of scoring their abilities on a 3-tiered Likert scale, which you're going to see throughout, this article. What's a problem? Can you think of a problem? What did you do to solve that problem? Who do you know that can help you solve problems? So really thinking about problem solving and this, decision making around problems as a very broad category of, behavioral repertoires. Then they would give them sort of 5 short stories of peer interactions, of which only some of them actually had a problem, and ask them questions related to, is there a problem? What would you do in this problem? Why is that the right solution?
Yeah. That's actually important to include.
Mm-hmm. Which I think this is the first time this was included in here, other than just sort of anecdotal. These students don't solve problems very well, or they haven't been shown to solve problems in the past.
Okay.
So in phase 2, they sort of broke out problem solving into just the steps of identifying the problems and generating solutions, and then the phase of sort of teaching the students to engage with the steps of problem solving. So they were just looking at the first 4 steps of their sort of problem solving chain. So they didn't include anything about choice making and the why, the justification of the solution. They just sort of focused on doing these like 6 one-hour sessions where they do very short stories, and not like the picture books in the other article I discussed. These were 2-sentence stories about something that really could happen. That was they were very, very brief and focused. They'd have photos, real photos that show a conflict between different children, different characters. And they'd present a few stories per session. They'd present the story. They'd focus on some comprehension questions like who's in the story, what did they do, and then they would sort of move on to identifying questions like, is there a problem in the story? What is the problem? How can it be solved? What else can be done? If there were delays in the child's ability to answer these questions, they'd sort of, do some probing questions like, what are you thinking? Let's think, as sort of an initial prompt. Then they'd give them feedback, or they'd get feedback from the student about, what did you think of the story? Was it easy for you to solve the story? And then they would sort of score the treatments. Now, it seemed like there was some sort of modeling built in here, but it really did seem like most of the treatment was just the repetition of giving lots and lots of stories and talking about lots and lots of answers related to problem-solving questions. It was kind of the whole intervention.
Well, that would imply modeling.
It would imply modeling.
And feedback.
It implies these things, yes. In phase 3, there was a little bit more training here in which the goal was to have the children memorize the steps of the problem-solving model. And this sort of went through kind of a scaffolded prompting where they would, model it. They would allow the child to answer the steps one at a time. Then they'd move on to a phase in which the child, answered all the questions of like, how do you solve a problem? And they'd have to list all of the steps of problem solving. They built in little
Nobody
maintenance
solves a
sessions.
problem like Maria, though.
Well, Maria is the problem that has to be solved. The answer is become a nanny to multiple Austrian children, German children. I don't remember. That solves all the problems.
Fair enough.
And then after the children were able to sort of memorize the steps of problem solving, they went back to do stories, looking at, 8 stories now in the second person, because the children were going to solve problems related to the story. So more like choose your own adventure than, hey, what do you think this kid in the story did? They used some other kind of verbal cues and some visual prompts. The verbal cues would be things like, I am thinking, is there a problem? I am answering. And then they'd sort of hold up a finger to count the steps of problem solving. They'd point to their mouth when they were answering, and they point to their brain when they were thinking about the statement. So again, giving them kind of a lot of frameworks for sort of self-talk, which again, we talked about that potentially being a good mediating factor when it came to decision-making and problem solving. Then again, they would practice, slowly with just, one piece at a time before moving on to, answering all the questions, all the problem-solving questions about the story. And then they do some generalization and maintenance, in this component. The generalization here really was just having the student make up original short stories, which I wish had a lot more treatment involved, because the idea of we taught these problem-solving skills over this period of time, and then our final product was the child made up their own curriculum for problem solving. I mean, that's an important part in those sort of, Maslow hierarchy of need kind of stuff, but not exactly what I would expect to just sort of jump out of nowhere at the very end of your treatment. Finally, we got to our last phase, which was the fourth phase, where they actually added the choice-making component. So you got to choose your choice of 3, and you justify the choice and describe some possible consequences. And I think this is really where, sort of when you were talking about the genesis of this episode, Diana, was where the decision-making comes in. It's not enough to just be able to make a choice. You have to then understand why that is or is not a good or best choice, and what might occur if you continue with that choice. Here was very similar, though. It was just sort of, again, reading the story, answering questions about which do you choose and why, then adding in training components where you're evaluating the social consequences, where you are sort of giving, feedback on the social and the emotional consequences, whether the solution is feasible and whether the solution is moral. And I liked their data sheet that they used for this because I think it takes into account the variations as to why a solution is or is not appropriate, because there are some amazing solutions that they're not feasible. Even if it's the best solution, you can't do it in the context you're in. So I think that's a very valuable component. However, again, not a lot of great information as to how they promoted students answering these questions other than just sort of presenting and talking about it and doing it over and over again. And then the data are, actually in this case it is because it's just a sentence, has been applied with success in a resource room unit by a qualified special education teacher with individual and or small groups of students. So that's kind of what we got. So at the end of the day, I think a lot of interesting components that really combine much of what Coach Sparks talked about, much of what Hune and Nelson talked about in sort of a nice little curriculum package, but again, without clear results as to whether this was effective, or not necessarily whether it was. I'm sure, at least anecdotally, it was effective, but how effective? And how much did this result in a change in long-term benefit to the children who are receiving this instruction? So again, one more model. Again, I think somewhat similar to some of the components in Flexible and Focused as well, which we talked about. So I guess with all of those discussions out of the way, let's move into Dissemination Station and kind of wrap up with some points for the future.
Points for the future. I was going to answer.
Future train.
Woo! It's the future train, but then I realized that I did not make the sound because it's not automatic, because I make it.
Say what?
I think points of the future, the thing that I love about my study is that they use those real life scenarios, and they used a lot of them across various domains, I think, of adulthood, right? So I think you could do the same thing if you're looking at elementary age kids or preschool age kids, but use lots of exemplars and allow the student to choose their own choices, right? So, because they might be different than yours. And like one of them's like, you decided you went to the birthday party. Maybe they don't want to go to the birthday party, and maybe that's a decision that they're going to make, right? And then how do you tell your friend then that you don't want to go to their birthday party? So I think that should also be taken into consideration.
Yeah, the Vlachu article got a little bit into that with their sort of choice-making phase. And I know it's in Dr. Nadowski's book in terms of making the choice and then reflecting on what happened when you engaged in that choice.
Yeah.
Because that's a piece that was missing in some of the articles we discussed and was a little vague in some of the others as to how much of this was just verbal behavior, how much of this was actual decision-making with opportunities for the naturally occurring consequences to occur.
Right. Yeah. So I think that's take home. If you're going to do this in the future, just make sure that you have different training scenarios than your assessment scenarios, and make sure they're relevant, right?
Yeah.
Like nobody cares about, do I want this clock or this clock? Right? Like, nobody cares about that, really.
Yeah.
Bigger things.
Clock selection.
Nobody cares.
I think the idea of an assessment, too, is important because a lot of these articles sort of, I think they got to coast on, and when it came time for the children to generate solutions, they did, thank goodness, because we weren't sure, what would have happened if they couldn't. And I think really it was the Hune and Nelson was the only one to sort of discuss what if the children struggled with making appropriate solutions. So some sort of an assessment to figure out how much can the student you're working with identify that there is or is not a problem, and then generate those solutions. Because if they're only able to come up with sort of a couple solutions and many of them are, not hitting that feasible or moral category of solution, you might want to take that step back and focus a little bit more on the generation, because it's hard to reflect. We don't really want to set kids up for like, oh, okay, you're going to destroy the person who's bothering you. Okay, let me know how it goes and we'll reflect on it after. Like, that's not really a safe solution.
Yeah.
And I think I didn't mention it when we were talking about Hune and Nelson, but one of the challenges for the preschoolers when they would struggle with categories of problem solving, situations where they wanted someone to stop doing something that they didn't like was the hardest problem. That is where you saw they saw the least appropriate solutions for the longest period of time. That's where the kids were struggling the most. So there's always that concern of, okay, that's an important problem. We don't want children or any individual to struggle with how do you get someone to stop doing something, and that maybe a separate category of problem than, say, I need to get something from someone, or someone's made a decision that I don't like in my collaborative, social studies project.
Yeah, I think that's fair, because there's other contingencies in place as well for that particular decision that may be harder to control for just based on your particular actions. We see that in our own children, in fact.
Oh, yes.
This whole area of research is completely wide open. I think that, like I said, this is kind of that midpoint of discussion along this whole track of choice making, decision making, problem solving. And any of those areas are ripe for future research. I think this is a really important area of research that we're looking at. It's applicable across individuals, whether they may have an intellectual disability, other type of developmental delay diagnosis, or are typically developing. Everyone needs to learn these types of skills. You could jump into this research stream in the area of teaching early level choice making. You could jump in here at this decision making level, and then there's some research on problem solving. But again, there's a lot of area for us to try to figure out the answers and best practice for some of these components that have been laid out in these studies. So if you're interested in this, you should jump on it.
All right. Well, that's
it.
That's the choice. That's the choice point where we decide to end the episode, I guess.
Love it.
Let's make sure everyone gets that second secret code word. It is construction. CONSTRUCTION. A sound of which I hope you don't hear on our audio. I guess we'll find out later how much of that
clunk,
came
clunk.
through. It's better than when they were jackhammering last week.
Yes.
That would have been a little harder to record.
Construction.
All right, and that brings us to the end of the episode. Thank you all very much for listening. We would really love it if you left us a review on Apple Podcasts. And if you like the show, if you subscribed, it could be on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, wherever you like to get podcasts. A couple other places you can find us. You can certainly go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, to find links to all of the articles discussed today, as well as links to purchase CEs for this or any of our many, many episodes that we've done in the past. You can send us an email at abainsidetrack@gmail.com with thoughts and feedback on the episode as well. We're on all the socials as ABA Inside Track. And you can join us on Patreon, where if you subscribe at the $5 level, you're able to earn discounts to CEs, as well as gain access to some extra bonus content, including the ability to vote on our live episodes, which we do kind of live, but in our little studio for now. Maybe someday we'll do it different, like actually someplace. We'll go to a place. Wouldn't that be fun?
No.
No? Jackie says no.
It's too far away.
Too far away.
Already I know it's too far away.
All right. Well, in any case, you can get access to those videos. You can get access to voting on a topic once per season at the $5 level. If you want even more ABA Inside Track content, you can subscribe at the premium $10 level to gain access to our extra long book club podcast, where we discuss a book related to behavior analysis. We had just recorded The Nurture Effect as our last one, and we will soon be recording, as of the release of this episode, a book on social justice. We don't even know what book it is yet because the poll just went up. So if you want to choose what the next book we read is, go to patreon.com/ABA Inside Track. Finally, big thanks to Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro and outro music, Kyle Sturry for our interstitial music, and Dan Thabit of the Podcast Doctors for his fabulous editing work. We decide to be back next week with another fun and fruitful episode. But until then, keep responding. Bye.
Bye.